Welcome to Uncovered in the Archives. I'm your host, Brad Pomerance. On today's episode, we visit a National Historic Landmark, the Mission Inn Hotel in Riverside, California. We will take you on a harrowing journey of the hotel's most revered art, Henry Chapman Ford's California Mission paintings. These masterpieces may elegantly grace the walls of the Mission Inn today, but they were almost lost into the dustbin of history, literally. That's coming up on Uncovered in the Archives.
Uncovered in the Archives is made possible in part by Loma Linda University Health. Additional support provided by Coachella Valley Water District, the City of Riverside, California, the County of Riverside, California, the City of La Quinta, California, and by contributions to your PBS station by viewers like you. Thank you.
Welcome. We are inside the Mission Inn Hotel and Spa in Riverside, California. We are joined by Karen Rains. Karen is an historian. She is the collections manager for the Mission Inn Foundation and Museum. Tell us a bit about the Mission Inn and the museum.
Well, we've actually had a hotel on site here since 1876, but the Mission Inn we know today was built between 1903 and 1931. There wasn't a Mission Inn museum until 1993.
Can I ask you about the California missions? I understand there are 21. What can you tell us about the missions?
The missions were actually built by Spanish Franciscans when Spain was an imperial power. They were built between 1769 and 1823. They go all the way from San Diego in the south up to Solano in the north. And they were mainly religious institutions that were built with the express purpose of converting the native population
to Catholicism, I believe.
Absolutely.
And I was looking inside the archives of the United States Library of Congress, and I found some images of those California missions from the 19th century. Quite beautiful. But I noticed that of the 21 missions, there are none in inland California. The closest would be in San Gabriel.
Correct. They built all of the missions along the coast to make it easier for the relief ships to reach them.
So Karen, is there a connection between the Mission Inn in Riverside and the California missions?
There isn't a direct connection, but California's missions did influence the Mission Inn's architecture.
Okay.
The best person to speak to about that is Walter Parks, who I did invite to the museum today.
Oh, thank you.
Would you like to go meet him?
I would love that.
Let's go. Brad, this is Walter Parks.
Nice to meet you, sir.
Walter's been instrumental in the restoration of the hotel for 40 years.
Wow, Karen, thank you so much for inviting Mr. Parks to join us, and thank you for being with us today.
You're welcome.
Mr. Parks, nice to meet you, my honor. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure indeed.
I want to speak with you about the property that we are on today. I understand that it was developed in the late 1800s by the Miller family, is that right?
That's correct. The Mission Inn is a creation of a man named Frank A. Miller. He's an icon in our community even today. And he came out with his family in 1874 as a teenager. His father was an engineer that went to work for the Colony Association that founded Riverside. And they had this square block here, and they built a house on it. Built it of adobe, covered it with wooden siding, and it was big enough to start taking in guests. And it was successful enough that they turned it into a small hotel
Called?
the Glenwood Hotel.
Right. Karen Rain showed us pictures from her archives of that Glenwood Tavern, Glenwood Inn from the late 1800s. So when did the Glenwood Inn become the Mission Inn?
Well, young Frank took over the Mission Inn from his parents in 1884, and he ran it as the Glenwood Hotel, Tavern, Cottages, whatever the name was, until the turn of the century. And this was the time of building of grand hotels in the West. And Frank and the city fathers wanted to build a grand hotel here in Riverside.
And they did that. And as I understand it, some of the greats of the early 1900s visited the Mission Inn.
That's true. Frank Miller entertained princes, movie stars. There's pictures here.
Right.
Here, behind me,
you.
yes, is President Teddy Roosevelt, who came in 1903, and he's planting one of the original orange trees that started the entire naval orange industry here.
Behind me, who is with Mr.
And
Miller?
this is Booker T. Washington on our little Mount Rubidel here in Riverside with Frank Miller. Booker T. Washington, of course, founded Tuskegee Institute.
Walter, if we look at pictures from the archives of the Mission Inn from the early 1900s, there's no question that the Mission Revival movement was influencing the architecture of this property. In 1907, we see a picture with the Mission arches. I think in the 1910s, there's another image, Garden of the Bells, you see the Mission bells. Then even in 1923, there's a picture where we see a car that is trying to lure, I guess, tourists to the Mission and talking about the words you see, Spanish Romance.
Well, the Mission Revival movement was an attempt by Californians in the latter part of the 19th century to establish identity. They were prospering out here in all aspects, and they didn't want to be just a copy of the East Coast or the Midwest. So they sought out their identity, and by this time people were looking at the long forgotten missions and starting to restore them. And that generated the Mission Revival movement, which was an architectural movement, an arts and crafts movement, a literary movement, and Frank Miller got caught up into that at the turn of the century.
In a big way, sir. And as I understand it, Frank Miller became acquainted with an artist, a painter, from the late 1800s named Henry Chapman Ford. Mr. Ford had painted the 21 missions. There were 38 paintings, and he coveted those paintings. He wanted those paintings here at the Mission Inn in Riverside.
That's correct, but you really need to talk to Barbara Byrne. She's the expert on that.
Okay.
And she's right here, next door, here in the museum.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, my pleasure.
So Barbara, what is your connection to the Mission Inn Museum?
I'm a docent here, have been for 20 years.
Yes, you have. You're an Uber docent, and I want to speak with you about an artist named Henry Chapman Ford. What we know is that Frank Miller, the owner of the Mission Inn in the early 1900s, was swept up in the Mission Revival movement. What can you tell us about that?
Well, he first saw them when he was on trips to San Francisco. They used to hang in Golden Gate Park. And he really liked them, and he thought they would be a wonderful illustration for this wonderful series of chapels that he had planned on building underneath the cloister wing.
And I want to show an image. It's actually a drawing of what we know as Cloister Walk inside the Mission Inn. And it was his wish to have at least some of the Henry Chapman Ford paintings displayed through the Cloister Walk.
Right. Mr. Ford had died in 1894, and he had wanted the paintings to stay in Northern California. So when Frank Miller went to the wife and said, will you sell me these? She said, no, I want them to stay in Northern California. That was Henry's wish. Frank was really persistent and really wanted these badly, and he finally talked her into loaning them to him, and he promised that he would give them back after the grand opening of this cloister walk.
And in fact, in your personal archives, you've shown me pictures of newspaper articles from the time that the cloister walk opened in the early 1910s.
Right, big article in the LA Times at that time, and they were talking about the fact that the Henry Chapman Ford paintings had been loaned to the Mission Inn for this big event.
Now, about a year after the cloister walk opened with some of the Henry Chapman Ford paintings, Mr. Miller still wanted to buy them desperately. Was he able to?
Yes, Mrs. Ford was in ill health and she was tired of arguing but trying to find a Northern California buyer. So when Frank made her an offer, she finally accepted it. So as of 1911, the paintings belonged to the Mission Inn.
But Barbara, about a decade later, a bona fide tragedy struck these paintings. I saw an article in your archives from the Press Enterprise about the flood of December 1921.
Right.
Tell us about it.
Right. Big flood at the Santa Ana River. Water comes up. There's flooding all around the Mission Inn. And the paintings, which are one level underground, get soaked.
And it's an absolute tragedy for these paintings.
In 1921, it was $5,000 worth of damage, and that was a lot of damage.
Now, a few of them are behind us today. but they suffered a tragic 20th century, without a doubt. We'll be talking about that. Let's continue, and I want to get a sense of what was happening then in the 1930s, because in a lot of ways, the fate of the Mission Inn was somewhat of a metaphor for the fate of the paintings.
Exactly, right.
So in 1935,
Mr. Miller dies, and the hotel goes into the hands of his heirs, and they run it for the next 30 years. Meantime, the paintings are still in the basement in various stages of disrepair.
literally from 1921 until at some
60s.
point the 60s,
Right.
we have these paintings rotting essentially.
These valuable, historically important paintings are down in the basement, and due to the fact that there's a lot of things happening at the Mission Inn having to do with changes in ownership and deferred maintenance and 100-year-old buildings getting older and older, nobody was paying attention to the state of these paintings.
So they were neglected. It's plain and simple.
Exactly. And in 1960, a housekeeper here at the inn saw them and said, these are not worthy of being hung in the walls of the Mission Inn anymore, and she tossed them.
This
All of them.
housekeeper,
Mrs. Peterson. Nice
Mrs. Peterson,
Yes, right.
tossed the 38 valuable historic paintings.
Badly damaged, looking pretty poor at the time. She was justified, I think.
And so what happened? They go into a
Well-
dumpster?
They're kind of sitting out waiting for the trash people to come and take them away. And lucky for us, a lady whose husband worked on the third floor of the Spanish wing as a doctor, she was coming to help him at work one day, and she saw that these paintings had been tossed out.
And her name?
Her name was Mrs. O'Toole, Patsy O'Toole.
I think we have a picture of Patsy O'Toole from the archives.
We do. And she thought that these paintings were far too important to be thrown out, and she brought them back into the building and put them where they had been.
Okay, so they're saved.
They're saved, right.
Are they?
Next day, Mrs. Peterson comes into work, looks at these paintings, goes, I thought I threw those out. So again, she throws them out. And again, Mrs. O'Toole is coming to work and sees that the paintings are in the trash. And she's had enough of it. She says, we can't just put them back where they were. I'm going to put them someplace where Mrs. Peterson won't throw them out again.
And
So she takes them and puts them up on the third floor of the Spanish wing, which is where they stay for a long, long time. Another 10 years.
Now, from what I've read about Patsy O'Toole, she was quite a visionary. She was really
Oh, yeah.
very committed to saving the historic artifacts inside the Mission Inn. In 1969, she was part of a group.
Right, founding member of the Friends of the Mission Inn, and it's kind of an ad hoc group of people who appointed themselves saviors of the art here because they saw the change in ownership, the Miller family had gone away, new people had come in who weren't from Riverside and didn't appreciate our art collection. The Friends of the Mission Inn was formed, and one of their first projects was to look at the Henry Chapman Ford paintings and see if they couldn't be saved.
So now we're in the 1970s,
Right.
the Friends of the Mission Inn, it's an active organization. What can you tell us about that era? Because as I understand it, that was really a pivotal time in terms of the life of these historic
Oh,
objects.
absolutely. The Friends stepped in and really took a really strong role. And you should talk to Walter Parks about this as well, because this is an area where he's an expert.
I think Walter is still inside the museum. Let's see if we can find him. Well, we found Walter Parks. He's still inside the Mission Inn Museum. Thanks for joining us again. I was speaking with Barbara Burns, and she mentioned the Friends of the Mission Inn. I know you were involved in that organization in the 1970s. What can you tell us about that?
Well, Friends of the Mission Inn were actually formed in 1969.
Right.
During the time we call the bad old days. Frank Miller had died in 1935, and his daughter and son-in-law in 1953, and the inn had gone through successive ownerships, and the inn was closed. And women, Patsy O'Toole being the most prominent of that group, but many other local women wanted to save the art and artifacts. So they formed an organization, as you said, called the Friends of the Mission Inn.
And we know that some of these successive owners that you mentioned from the 1950s on were trying to sell off artwork because they were trying to make money with the Mission Inn in disrepair.
Things were sold, but fortunately, the Henry Chapman Ford paintings stayed.
So I want to take us to the mid-1970s. Around that era, the Mission Inn falls into bankruptcy, and the city of Riverside pulls it out of bankruptcy, acquires it?
That's correct. And they bought it in 1976 and created a foundation to run it.
You were one of the early presidents of that
I was
foundation.
actually the third president in succession, yes.
So, as I understand it, the Friends of the Mission Inn and the Mission Inn Foundation wanted to save the art, wanted to restore the art. And I saw in the archives that there's a flyer that talks about raising money for the artwork and its restoration.
They did have a fundraising campaign to do restoration at the inn and to do specifically restoration of the artifacts. And Friends have continuously done that. But today I've invited Scott Haskins, who was the restorer of the Henry Chapman Ford paintings, to come here. So he's here to visit with us.
I don't know what to say. I just got chills. I thank you for inviting Scott Haskins. I guess I read he's the original restorer of these Henry Chapman Ford paintings. Let's go find Scott Haskins.
Let's do it.
Hello, Brad. Scott Haskins.
I was looking for
How are
you.
you? Yeah, nice to
Good
meet
to
you.
meet you. Thank you so much for
You're
joining
welcome.
us.
My pleasure.
Before we talk about the Henry Chapman Ford painting, could you tell us about yourself?
Yes, I'm a fine art conservator. Our company only works on the restoration of paintings,
Okay.
and I've been doing this since 1975.
Okay, I want to ask you about these paintings. Henry Chapman Ford, I learned, painted 38 scenes of the 21 California missions. What do we know about his efforts to paint those scenes in the late 1800s?
The paintings were painted between 1874 and 1886. This was a period of development in the state of California. There were no roads, there was no infrastructure, basically, to get around and drive. And in order to see these 21 missions, you had to be on a horse, you had to be a rugged individual going off the beaten path in order to go find them.
And as I understand it, I've looked at some of the photographs of the missions during the 1870s and 1880s from various archives. They look dilapidated.
They were dilapidated, they were forgotten. They were falling down, they were going into ruins.
And as I understand it, his efforts were so successful that the mission revival movement really took off in the wake of the popularity of the Henry Chapman Ford paintings.
That is a great insight, because in California, all of a sudden, these paintings became standards or images of the olden days, the old Spanish days, the legend of Zorro.
So Scott, we learned from Walter Parks, from Barbara Burns, that these paintings, 38 of them, had been acquired by Frank Miller, the original owner of the Mission Inn. But throughout the 20th century, they were neglected, they fell into disrepair, and by the 1970s, they were all but forgotten. Talk to us about how you got involved in the restoration of these California mission paintings.
All right, so I was brought in to save these paintings that were in bad condition, but I didn't know really what they were.
And this is around the mid-1980s?
Yes, about 1985.
And at that time, the Mission Inn was closed.
That's right.
It was
That's right.
going through renovations
That's right.
itself.
Actually, it was more than closed. There had been some pilfering of the collection of the Mission Inn.
So you arrive in Riverside,
Right.
you walk into the Mission Inn. Where did you find the paintings?
Well, after we got through the chain link fence and that kind of, it was empty. Up in the very, very top of the Mission Inn, in a place that was just horrific,
What was it called?
Pigeon Road, and it was knee deep in pigeon poop.
And we have one picture from your archive of Pigeon Row filled with pigeon poop. I want to talk, though, about what happened next, because as if the paintings didn't suffer a horrific enough fate over the past decades, your employer at the time, the person that hired you to restore the paintings, he got into some trouble.
Yeah, well, these were investors that wanted to put together a conservation lab to service museums and collections and collectors all over the Western United States. And one of them got into financial problems, and that pulled everything associated with him into a bankruptcy. And so that company closed down, that lab closed down.
And you literally had to abscond with the paintings?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
where were the paintings
Well,
when this person went
they
bankrupt?
were sucked into the bankruptcy, right? And we snuck them out of storage, and I got possession of them. And then when I got possession of them, I spoke to the Friends of the Mission. I said, I'd really like to finish this project for you. I love what we've got going on here. These are super important paintings. Let's finish them up for the money that you've got left and save them.
It just goes to show you those paintings wanted to live another
They did.
day.
That's absolutely right.
Let's go back to the condition of the
Yeah.
paintings when you pulled them out of Pigeon Road.
That's a hard thing to describe to you. They were such a train wreck, but let me show you. I knew we would look at them.
Okay.
I've got these slides here are the ones that I brought with me.
Oh, that's
The
your
screen,
slide
yeah, this
projector?
projector with the carousel.
You have one?
Totally old school. Let's look at.
Let's do that.
Okay.
Come on. This is awesome.
Yeah,
Very
this is
old
great,
school, real slide projector. What are we looking at?
The painting of the Santa Cruz Mission.
Okay.
And the only reason we have it today is because there was glass on the front that held the paint in place because the canvas had shrunk and all the paint popped off.
This looks terrible.
It was horrible, horrible. Absolutely, you couldn't have a worse situation for a painting.
I don't know how you recovered this. How did you actually restore this?
Very carefully.
Right.
No, the idea was that, of course, we had to protect the paint to hold it all together. So this image shows an armature or a facing over the top of the paint to hold it all in place. We had to detach the canvas from the back of the paint.
Wow.
In other words, we had to lift the paint off of the canvas. It's just amazing.
So Scott, what are we looking at here? It's as if there are 4 gradations or something.
Well, it's unbelievable, but the painting, even though it looks so bad, had already been through 4 generations of restoration. And this is the removal of those 4 different levels of restoration. It was kind of like an archaeological dig.
Clearly. And so the final product?
And so at the end, this is what we ended up with. This is the painting by Henry Chapman Ford, after we'd removed all the repainting by previous artists.
So you have another example, Scott?
Yes, this is San Antonio de Paula.
It is?
Yeah.
That's a painting?
It's amazing. This is extensive water damage. There's pigeon poop all over it. There's a lot of dust and things from the attic. And the varnish has clouded over.
You were able to save this?
Well, that's our job. And this shows another photograph of the light coming through the back. So it's
there are
showing.
holes,
Yeah,
rips.
there's holding and rips and things like that we're highlighting for our documentation process. But this is the painting after we finished.
Wow.
Beautiful.
Absolutely beautiful.
This is San Diego de Acala.
No, it's not. I mean,
It's,
I can't see anything
Yeah,
here.
it's amazing. The extensive water damage, you can see the drips of the water pattern, and it was just a mess, absolutely a mess. This is the painting after we removed all the previous restorations and brought it back to original Henry Chapman Ford.
Stunning. So Scott, how long did it take for you and your team to restore these 30+ paintings?
The process took about 4 years.
4 years, and look who's back.
Hello,
Karen
gentlemen.
Raines from the Mission Inn Museum. Karen, I want to speak with you about the state of the paintings today. It's a miracle that the paintings survive today. What we know is they were damaged by a flood, they were ripped, they were chipped, they were thrown out twice, they were stored with pigeon poop, they were poorly restored, they were put into a barn by an unscrupulous conservator. I mean, I can't imagine that these paintings are still with us, but they are where?
You're going to find them throughout the hotel. They're located in the museum, the lobby, Dwayne's Steakhouse, Ramona Courtyard, and the Spanish Art Gallery.
And they are quite majestic as they grace the walls of this National Historic Landmark. I want to ask you, Karen, as an historian, what's the significance of the Henry Chapman Ford California Mission paintings?
We can actually find a lot of significance even beyond the canvas of the paintings, what they actually represent, which is the mission system established by Spain. Spain brought with it a lot of positive and negatives with the mission system. So they did introduce new foods, horses, cattle, technology, but they also ways large and small. We saw the oppression and some ways the destruction of native culture.
That's true, no doubt. Scott, let me ask you, as an art connoisseur, as an art conservator, What would you say is the significance, the import of the Ford paintings?
This was a documentation and a representation of our heritage. It's part of the legacy of history and our background of California, of architecture, of art, of a style that was embraced throughout the Western United States, even throughout the United States, the Spanish revival, this mission style. And they're irreplaceable, they're national treasures. They've been characterized as such by many scholars.
Right, and I want to thank you so much, Scott Haskins, for joining us. Karen Raines as well. We thank Walter Parks, Barbara Burns, and of course we thank you for joining us. This has been a remarkable journey learning about Henry Chapman Ford's 38 California Mission paintings. We are coming to you from the Mission Inn in Riverside, California. I'm Brad Pomerance for Uncovered in the Archives.
Uncovered in the Archives is made possible in part by Loma Linda University Health. Additional support provided by Coachella Valley Water District, the City of Riverside, California, the County of Riverside, California, the City of La Quinta, California, and by contributions to your PBS station by viewers like you. Thank you.